Who has actually spent any time around sheep? A little bit. Yeah. Both my parents, my grandparents and my aunt raised sheep for wool and for meat. Sheep have unique personalities. One way you can, here to an example. A few years ago, there was this viral video that went around that I think perfectly describes sheep. In this video, a sheep was stuck in a ditch along the side of a road. And the farmer, the shepherd, was pulling and tugging and trying to get the sheep out of the ditch, gets the sheep out of the ditch, and then the sheep happily bounds away, running down the road, and then proceeds to jump right back into the ditch. Because, well, she's a sheep. And as I searched online for this video to remind me, I found dozens of videos of sheep doing similar things. You see, sheep may be intelligent, and they might be animals who can recognize your face and your voice. But they also lack common sense. They need a leader. They need a shepherd. The sheep need a shepherd to keep them from running off a cliff or jumping in the ditch. Without the shepherd, sheep are actually known to run off and try to make it on their own, which may work for a while, but after a while their wool will get so thick that they can't see, they can't move, and they'll end up just standing there bleating. Well, they might be bleating, but bleating until help comes. A few years ago, there was another story of sheep on the internet where this farmer finds his missing sheep, who had probably been gone for about 15 months or so, and it just wool covering the face, couldn't move, had bramble stuck in it, it just couldn't walk. There was so much wool there. Sheep need a leader. Sheep need a shepherd to keep them safe and together. One of the many crises the events of the last 5 years or so have uncovered is this crisis of authority. As conflicting reports, scientific studies, expert voices have told us how to combat the army of challenges, the many of challenges we have faced. People have grown cynical and suspicious and weary of trying to figure out whose leadership we can trust, who's telling the truth, whose voice should we be listening to. Our gospel reading for the fourth Sunday in the Easter season, shows us a version of leadership quite different from the ones we are used to in the world today. John describes a leader who lays down his life, not with words, but with costly actions. A leader who literally places his body in harm's way for the sake of his sheep. This is a leader with integrity and courage, a leader with skin in the game, a leader who is good. Now, if you've grown up in the church, you probably learned about this leader. It's Jesus, the Good Shepherd. You heard of him? And you may have an image pictured in your mind about this Jesus, the Good Shepherd. And I'm going to be willing to bet it looks like this. I am holding up this picture of white Jesus with light brown hair in a white robe, very clean, holding a cuddly little lamb. I don't know if you can see it on the video, probably not. But if you Google Jesus the Good Shepherd on Google image search, this will come up. And if this is what came to mind when we talk about Jesus the Good Shepherd, you're not alone, and there's nothing wrong with it. This particular piece of art is a very popular image of the Good Shepherd. Very popular. And of course, there's a lot missing from this kind of picture. I mean, for a shepherd who's supposed to be living outside among the sheep, he's rather clean. This is not the guy I would expect to be trudging through the Palestinian rocky hills in search of a patch of grass with stubborn sheep. I see this guy walking through a field of wildflowers with happy, frolicking lambs bouncing around him as this music swells in the background. Sound of music just showed him up in my head there. In fact, I'm not sure I trust that guy as the shepherd. He looks too much like me to be good at such a hard scrabble job. But when we see these images of Jesus as a doe-eyed good shepherd cuddling these tiny helpless lambs, or carrying one over his shoulder, there's another one where he's got it over his shoulder. And it's comforting. It's a nostalgic image for us. And we immediately begin to think of Psalm 23, perhaps, of never wanting anything, of still waters and green pastures. It's the image of gentle power. Someone who can control the uncontrollable in the world. And isn't that kind of what we want from Jesus? We want Jesus to be able to tame what is wild and unruly in the world, who with the crook of his staff can solve what's unsolvable and answer what's unanswerable in life, who can protect and defend us against the thieves and the bandits of this world who only come to steal and kill and destroy. But regardless of what we want, we eventually come face to face with the reality that the world is still wild and unruly. There are still questions without answers, and there are still thieves and bandits in the world bent on destruction. Excuse me. So where's the Good Shepherd in the middle of all of this destruction? Where is a shepherd that will fix what's wrong with the world, who will clean up all that is messy and misplaced in our lives? Where is the one who will protect me as I dwell in the house of the Lord? I asked myself these questions as I read over this text this week, and it struck me that these questions come from a misreading, on my part, I think, of these Good Shepherd passages in John's Gospel. In the beginning of the 10th chapter, earlier, before we get to our reading, we have to remember, when the Bible was written, there weren't chapter and verses, so this is all one narrative. We hear Jesus saying, "The one who enters through the gate is the shepherd of the sheep. The guard at the gate opens the gate for him, and the sheep listen to his voice. He calls his sheep by name, and he leads them out. Whenever he has gathered all his sheep, he goes before them, and they follow him, because they know his voice." And then Jesus goes on to say, "I came so that they could have life. Indeed, so that they could have abundant life." And so reading this, I came to realize that what I was asking for was I was asking to live inside the walled-off reality of the sheepfold. The sheepfold was essentially this secure pen in the wilderness, constructed of large stones. It kept the sheep safe inside and guarded by a gatekeeper while the shepherd was away. If you've ever watched All Creatures Great and Small, you'll see James Herriot going to visit sheep. You'll see these sheepfolds out there in the Yorkshire wilderness. And so then as I'm reading, I asked where the shepherd was. And I didn't like the answer that I got out of the text, because it meant I'd gotten this safe and secure image of the shepherd wrong for me all these years. I always assumed that it was the shepherd was leading the flock to safety. But that's not really the case, is it? He's leading them out of the sheepfold. The shepherd arrives to take the sheep out of the sheepfold. He calls the sheep away from the safety of the walled-off pen. And they follow the shepherd. Not to safety, but to the open wilderness. Because that's where the shepherd always is. The shepherd comes to drive out his sheep from the confines of safety in the pasture, into the pasture, where there is abundant life. Think about it. You get all those sheep inside the sheep pen, inside the sheepfold. It's going to be a muddy mess. There's not going to be much grass in there. But you get the sheep outside. There's beautiful grass and food. Abundant life. Now, it's not necessarily safe life, mind you. Outside of that sheep pen, there's most certainly that green pasture and still waters. There are also roaming predators and wolves and bandits. There's also a valley shadowed by death. But that's where Jesus is, laying down his life for the sheep. As I read and studied this week, I kept coming back to this image of Jesus casting the sheep out from the sheep pen, leading them out into the pasture in the wilderness. And I kept thinking about how often Jesus in the Gospels is breaking bread with those society calls outcasts. I kept thinking about how Jesus held these outsiders up as examples of profound faith. How Jesus chose to befriend them. I kept thinking about what Jesus says that every time we see the hungry, the poor, the thirsty, the lonely, the disenfranchised, the outcast, we're seeing Jesus himself. And then I began to wonder if when we hear the voices of those outcasts in society, those disenfranchised, those marginalized, if we hear that voice for what it is, the voice of Jesus, the voice of the shepherd, calling us out from the safety of the sheepfold to be a flock of the cast out. Grateful Dead drummer Mickey Hart wrote, "To fall in love is to fall in rhythm." When we spend time in the wilderness with Jesus, our shepherd, and with the outcasts and the marginalized, we get to know them and we fall in rhythm with them, growing in love for Jesus as we love our neighbors. And that's where we find abundant life. In a society that prioritizes everyone for themselves, Jesus is calling you to love one another through your actions and your deeds. And not just for charity's sake. As Leela Watson, an Aboriginal woman in Australia, explained to well-intentioned folk coming in to help the outcast there, she writes, "If you come here to help me, you're wasting your time. But if you have come because your liberation is bound up with mine, then we can work together." That's the point, I think, in that in some way this boundary-crossing shepherd is calling you to the idea that your liberation, your salvation, is tied up with the salvation and liberation of all people. And that's why the shepherd comes to the sheep pen and calls you out into the wild pasture. Because that is where salvation is. That's where abundant life is waiting. In a few moments, you'll be hearing some stories of transformation because of your mission and ministry in the community. These are just a small sampling of the amazing work we are able to do as a church because of us. Because we are brave and courageous enough to follow Jesus out of the sheepfold and into the community. And so it is my prayer and my hope that we will continue to find ways to reach out into the community to share the love of Christ. Are you with me? Amen.